probably I'm going to raise more questions than I answer. I'm not going to be answering any questions. There are not going to be any solutions, just things to think about, basically. And this presentation is about my struggle with being given a conversation class in title only, no curriculum, syllabus, guidelines, or anything else. And for those of you teaching at university, I'm sure you're familiar with, here's a conversation class and off you go.
What textbook did they give you? What was the required text?
Book, I'll talk about that a little bit later. Some books that I've used and I choose to use if I'm teaching conversation class. So I'll talk about that later, but many of us have been given a class, it's conversation English, and then off you go. Or we've been given a book for conversation English, and that book frequently doesn't reflect what conversation is and may teach general English but not add any elements of English conversation. And what I'm going to talk about, again, this is very broad. It's going to be a brief summary of the nature of conversation, planning a conversation course, teaching, and then ultimately assessing. I'm talking about all of these things because they're all linked. We can't teach general English and then assess conversation. We can't teach conversation and then assess grammar. Everything needs to be connected. If it's not, there are going to be questions raised over the validity of your course. So the first, sorry, I'll just go to the graphic. So this shows how they're all linked. You get given a conversation class, but what is conversation? How does that link to my goals and objectives? How do I realize those goals and objectives in the class? And then how do I ultimately assess this? And assessing conversation is probably the most difficult thing here to do, objectively and reliably, and in terms of validity as well, probably. First of all, I'm going to pose the question: what is conversation? That's a question for everybody. Is this conversation? No. Up until now, it hasn't been. But now I'm asking, and you're going to respond.
I say it's question and answer.
Question and answer?
Meaningful.
So meaningful, question and answer. An interview can be question and answer. Is that a conversation?
It's a mutual exchange.
Exchange?
Yeah, a mutual exchange of ideas.
Right. So exchanging ideas, generally interpersonal in nature, but has elements of transaction as well.
It can be non-verbal too.
Yes, eye contact and those sorts of things can be important as well. And that leads us, and that I'll talk about later about assessment, is if you don't make eye contact, do you deem that they are not fulfilling what it is to have a conversation if they're not looking at each other? So that makes it notoriously difficult. So, is this a conversation?
Short one.
It's a short conversation. Conversation can be very short. I say, hi, how's it going? You say, good. I'm going to go, see you later.
I think
Could be a
there's
conversation.
no
Interaction.
Homer Simpson has no
Interaction. Still bit, actually. That's why he says, no need for me to participate. Okay.
Yeah.
But the structure follows. We've got the greeting, and then inquiring about health, and then leave taking. So that fulfills part of what it might be to have a conversation. Thornbury and Slade, they define conversation in this way. It's spoken, first of all, spontaneous. So we meet and we create it at that particular time. Shared context, we're usually face-to-face, so we're in the same area, or the same physical context. Interactive and jointly constructed. You work together to make a conversation. It's interpersonal, generally, but there are some transactional elements in conversation as well, at times. Informal. This is one of the problems. If we have a formal exam and conversation is seen as informal, then that creates some some problems. Some questions can be raised over that. And we express, as you said, we express our feelings, ideas, those sorts of things. So that's how they defined conversation. Nolasco and Arthur, they have quite an old book now called Conversation, published by Oxford. So you can go out there and check it out if they've got it at the table. And they say a similar thing, that it's involving exchange, maintenance of social relationships that reflects the interpersonal nature of conversation, negotiation of social roles, these sorts of things. So basically it involves two or more people, it's interactive, it's interpersonal in nature, it's spoken, not written, which creates problems when we assess, when we teach, but also particularly when we assess in terms of grammar and vocabulary. And Thornbury and Slade, they provide this little chart which shows some of the qualities of conversation. Conversation is at the bottom and fulfills all of these roles that we can see. Spoken, spontaneous, dialogic, synchronous, at the same time, interpersonal, and usually you have a similar relationship. One other thing in this list is very similar to conversation. What is that? Chat room exchange. So if we go into a chat room and we're chatting to someone on the computer, then it's very similar to a conversation. The only difference is that it's not spoken, it's written. But it involves many of the same elements that a spoken conversation contains. Therefore, it's something that we can do to simulate conversation. It's not exactly the same mode, but it can be something that we can do by distance, particularly. And that's a chat room, but we can also use messenger software and things like that. We can also use a webcam as well these days. And therefore, we take away that written element, and it has all of the same elements as a conversation, and it's spoken as well. Whether you want to chat to all of your students via webcam is another question. Whether you have the time to do that or the desire. Some other things we need to consider when we talk about conversation. Conversation is jointly constructed, it's made up of adjacency pairs, but it's a little bit more than that. We have questions and answers, or we have adjacency pairs where someone says, "How are you doing?" and you say, "I'm fine." Those things are going together, and we use those to build a conversation. But we can also create a structure, or a kind of a discourse structure of conversation. And Ventela did this, and this is the structure that she came up with. Greeting, address, or identification. These are optional, of course, depending on whether you know the person. How's the family? And then we usually talk about a few different topics. We leave tape and say, "I have to go," and say goodbye. So when I think about conversation, I think of it as a whole text. And you said the Dilbert cartoon was a very short conversation, but it still had greeting, and there was an approach, and there was some leave taking. So it contained these elements, even though it's very short. If you meet your friend and go to the pub and have some soju, this section here, centering, could last for 3, 4, 5 hours, right? But it will still start out in the same way. Whenever we have a conversation, we follow this every single time. So to me, I use this as a basis for teaching conversation. Students need to know how to start and how to end a conversation. In the middle, there are so many things that can go on, but once we can do that, then they can create a whole conversational text. And within the conversation, they can do many, many things. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I use this as a basis, not this exactly, but I like to use the discourse structure of a conversation as something that students can learn, and ultimately that's the goal of a conversation class. Is by the end of the course they should be able to have a conversation about a variety of topics and use some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So conversation is not just willy-nilly all over the shop. It, as Eggins and Slade say, it's a highly structured, functionally semantic activity. There is a structure to a conversation. And Gardner talks also about the fact that having a conversation is not just about correct grammar and correct vocabulary. Responding appropriately in that particular social context or cultural context is also an important factor in conversation. And this leads into some research done by Dornier, and they basically broke down conversation into 4 areas. They broke it down into conversational rules and structures. So this deals with the discourse structure, where we have openings and closings, and then management of the conversation, turn taking, changing topics, those sorts of things. But what happens when there's a breakdown in the conversation? If I don't know a word? Silence, right? If I don't know a word, there's silence. The conversation breaks down. There's no sound. In English conversation, are we happy with a long pause? No, we feel uncomfortable. We want to fill it in. We need to repair, perhaps. So we need conversational strategies. Appeal for help, asking for repetition, asking for clarification, these sorts of things. When there's a breakdown in communication, we need to be able to fix it. And that's some skill that we can teach our students as well. So we can look at the structure, and we can look at how we can maintain and manage the conversation itself. There's a third area about functions and meanings in conversation. We need to express ideas, show agreement, disagreement, all these sorts of things. Whenever we teach speaking, speech acts and functional language is usually a pretty large part of a speaking course. We need to disagree politely, which is a skill many students don't have, as we know, but something that is important if we want to maintain the conversation and maintain our interpersonal relationship as well. So we need the structure, we need to deal with breakdowns, we need to express our ideas using functions, and we also need to be aware of social and cultural contexts. And this is a little bit, can be a little bit vague and a little bit tricky, but we can raise awareness of different social contexts and cultural contexts to help students understand this. Cross-cultural differences and intercultural understanding can also be something that we can try to deal with in this situation. Not every culture has exactly the same way of having a conversation. I think in Thornbury's, one of Thornbury's books, he compares British English and, British conversations and I think Norwegian conversations. And the importance placed on small talk, for example, is quite different. The topics you talk about when engaging in small talk in Britain were not the same as in Norway. I think in Britain they're always talking about the weather, right? In Norway they weren't interested in that. Small talk was much shorter in Norway and much longer and much more important in the conversation. So raising some awareness of how English-speaking cultures conduct conversations and the importance on the different sections of the conversation.
Does Dornier and Terrell discuss that?
Sorry?
Does Dornier and Terrell discuss that? Do you remember? That kind of stuff?
No, this is just a brief journal article, so they didn't go into a lot of detail. But we can see there's some other resources which I'll talk about a little bit later. So, brief overview of the nature of conversation. To me, when I was given a conversation class, I needed to decide what is conversation. If I'm going to teach conversation, what is it? So I had to answer that question. We need to answer that question because that feeds into how we plan our course. How do we organize and what goals and objectives do we have in a conversation course? Our goals and objectives are based on our understanding of what conversation is. They're all linked. Our curriculum, our beliefs, the curriculum, the syllabus, how we teach, and then our assessment are all connected. And our beliefs about how language should be taught is also a factor. So we think about what conversation is. Now we need to plan. And we might come up with some general goals about the ability to start, manage, maintain, or end the conversation. We might talk about the jointly constructive nature of conversation. These could be our general goals. And then within these general goals, we can have some specific objectives that feed into them. To be able to start, manage, maintain, and end a conversation, we need to do different things. We need to know how to open and close conversations, but to maintain or manage a conversation, we need to have understanding of turn taking, for example, obtaining, retaining, or relinquishing a turn. So we need to have some idea how to hold the floor sometimes, how to interrupt and get a turn, which can be tricky sometimes. Non-native speakers have trouble doing that when they're talking to a native speaker. Native speakers tend to dominate. One reason is it's harder for non-native speakers to interrupt and get a turn. It's a lot harder for them to do that. If we want to keep our conversation going, we need to be able to repair it. If there's a breakdown, we need to know how to fix that. So we can have our general goals about being able to create a conversation, and then we need some more specific objectives that feed into those. These are some examples from the language teaching matrix. It's a chapter from Jack Richards, so you can check that out. And I'll mention that in references later. Some specific examples that we can, specific conversation strategies or conversation skills that we can teach. And this comes from a book that I have used for teaching conversation called Touchstone. And it explicitly teaches things like showing interest, saying more than yes or no, so expanding your answer, not just giving a short reply, asking questions in two ways, follow-up questions, and these kinds of things. And it goes into lots of other things like using well as a hesitation device. There's a lot of material around that doesn't explicitly teach these kinds of things. But as you know, we use well, I mean, you know, that kind of thing, that sort of thing. We use lots of these phrases or formulaic phrases in our conversation. Students don't usually, which actually makes it harder for them to produce spoken language. We use lots of these formulaic phrases to take a break while we're formulating our next utterance. Right? When I took a training program a long time ago, my trainer used the word couching, in which our message is actually couched in between these different phrases. If I ask you something, you might say, well, basically, the thing is, blah, 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 our message, and then say, you know what I mean, that sort of thing. We often have that structure. So it makes our language more fluent, it gives us a little bit of a break time. Non-native speakers, if they don't use these formulaic phrases, have to produce utterances and convey their message straight away, without any little break in between. Because they have to do that, it's much harder and it takes a lot longer to produce that particular utterance. Therefore, they seem disfluent. They're not as fluent as a native speaker. Native speaker uses these and and they appear more fluent. And we keep these, we store many of these formulaic phrases, and we pop them out every now and again so that it's nice, there's a nice flow. It's like the oil that makes our engine run smoothly. If we took out these formulaic phrases, it'd be much harder. There'd be a lot more pausing. It wouldn't be as much flow in our speech. So, to me, teaching these can assist in that way.
They discourage, for instance, Korean students have this tendency to translate in their minds phrases like, they say, in Korean it's very common usually to say, at that time I was doing this, and at that time this is what happened. So they constantly use that phrase, at that time. And I find it kind of and then say, well, this is how we should talk? Or what would you do in that situation?
Well, that's linked to frequency of use in a way. I don't think that many native speakers use at that time before they speak.
Well,
Or in my case, or frankly speaking, or any of these other famous ones.
No, I've had that used quite often, actually, when I was when I was studying in the US, and there were
Oh, really?
students who were foreign students there, because they wanted to practice conversation. So maybe not in this first level, but yeah, I've done those kind of things. Oh, it's Konglish, that's the thing, what I'm asking you about. Is
Yeah.
Konglish something that you would just completely discourage, or would you just want them to talk?
That's a good question. To me, ultimately, if they're using phrases or language that native speakers don't use, then they're going to sound unnatural. Therefore, I would encourage them to use phrases that native speakers would use. I'll talk a little bit later, if we have time, maybe not, about corpora and how corpora can inform us about phrases, the frequency of particular phrases and those sorts of things. I think, yeah, there are favorite expressions that different cultures use, and at that time was one that's common in Korea. I would encourage them to use other phrases generally, or to replace them with more frequently used phrases from that native speakers would use. But the problem is, how do we know what native speakers use? What we reckon people use and what people actually use can be quite different. That's where corpus, the corpora, comes in and can help us out in that way. So these expressions and this book, which I think, hang on, I'll just move on. I might just skip a little bit. I might just skip that part actually. And this is from a book that I used to teach English conversation. It's called Touchstone. I don't necessarily, I'm not getting paid by Cambridge or anything, but to me it's a book that focuses on conversation skills more than any other course book.
Is it just one book or a series?
It's a series, 4 books, 1 to 4.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, when we plan, I have goals and objectives that I want to teach conversations skills to my students. There are 2 things we can do. We can develop our own materials, or we find materials published by, already published that we can access. Designing your own materials for teaching conversation is possible. You can get authentic, you can record authentic interaction and transcribe it and use it to teach. I have done that actually, but it takes a lot of work. I haven't done that in Korea, but in Australia I've done that.
Do you remember the level?
Well, this is book 1. So I use this for freshman English classes, and it has a specific strategy up the top, asking questions in 2 ways, which is a pretty common thing. We often ask a WH question followed by a yes/no question because it makes it easier for your interlocutor to respond. What did you do last weekend? Did you see a movie? Yes or no is much easier than us responding to the WH question. We can say yes or no, and then we can expand on it. So we do it quite frequently. And the strategy plus up the top is I mean. And this book is corpus informed. So it mentions up here that I mean is one of the top 15 expressions. And I think when we look at 2-word phrases that go, there are 2-word, 3-word, 4-word, I mean, or you know what I mean, or those kinds of things. Mean is a very, very common word in English, in spoken language. No is a very common word. Not because I know him, but because of, you know?
You know what I mean?
Do you know what I mean? So, no is really common. We need to be careful. You mentioned at that time, Korean speakers using at that time too frequently. If you use you know too frequently, is that, you know, going to be okay? You know? I mean, you know, the other day I was like, you know, is that okay? Well, some of you might have seen Caroline Kennedy being interviewed. If you go to YouTube, type in Caroline Kennedy and you know. And she was criticized because every second word that came out of her mouth was you know. And she was running for Senate or something, public office, and they said, you know. Can't stop.
Oh, Andrew? I would just mention, I think the book Conversation Strategies by K&K is a similar kind.
Yes. I'll mention that. That's in my list of books that we can use for teaching conversation. I'm not a huge fan because it's a little bit too deductive. It sort of just presents the strategy and then off you go practice it.
I use it as a supplement.
Yeah, as a supplement.
Or
And,
intermediate.
yeah. And I used to use it as well as a supplement until some books came out that contained conversation strategies and skills within them. The thing I prefer regarding this material over the conversation strategy book is this is presented in context. They have a little dialogue, they listen to the dialogue, they have to, it's inductive, more inductive, they have to find the strategy. So I prefer that. But if you like deductive, then there are some other books as well.
Does the book have a reading to create a theme for the chapter there, or
Sorry?
does the chapter have a
But
theme?
this is lesson C. So
One page, 3 page?
these are 2 pages. So basically 25% of the book is conversation strategy.
Okay.
So it's a little bit better to me for teaching conversation.
So
There's lesson A, B, C, D. A and B focus is a more traditional, focusing on reading, listening, those sorts of things. C has conversation strategies and D has reading and writing. So 25% of every unit is focusing explicitly on conversation skills. There's another example here of answering a question and asking a similar one, or anyway. I use anyway a lot. My students are very familiar with my use of anyway, because I come into class, they're chatting, and then anyway, enough of that, and let's actually start the class, or let's get on with things. So we use these all the time. When you look at this book, because it's corpus informed, you'll look at it and go, wow, we really do talk like that. We really do use these phrases. And that's a big problem with a lot of materials, is you look at it and like, who the hell wrote this dialogue? Nobody. It's just so contrived, right?
Our professors did.
Sorry? Yeah, right.
Our professors did.
Right.
We have the.
That's the problem. Even as a native speaker, do you really know the kinds of things that people say? We don't. Right, exactly. We don't want to guess. We can be told by the corpus. You might have had an argument with your girlfriend, boyfriend, and you said blah 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 blah. No, I didn't say that. We never know what we actually say. If you recorded it, you probably find out that you're both wrong. How we remember things is not necessarily how they occurred when we were speaking. Okay. I don't want to go on for too long. I'll just mention quickly that many elements of listening and speaking are reflected in conversation, because conversation involves those 2 skills. When I teach conversation class, I don't want to teach a speaking class. I also want to teach listening. Not listening to a contrived dialogue on the CD. That can be part of our class if we listen to an authentic dialogue, authentic conversation perhaps, to raise awareness. But listening to each other. When we have a conversation, we listen and respond to the person, our interlocutor, the person we're talking to. We do that in a number of ways. Body language, nodding, eye contact, back channeling, we say yeah, these kinds of things. So I encourage that when my students are interacting in the class. Because they don't. If we don't encourage them, they're just going to sit there and read the conversation and not look at each other. Right? So I always encourage them to make eye contact and those sorts of things. So most listening is done in this way, face to face. We don't listen to the radio. We listen to the radio and TV, of course, but a lot of listening is active listening. It's not passive. Many elements of speaking, of course, are reflected in conversation. I'll just skip through a couple of things. To me, I prefer to teach conversation skills directly. I want to explicitly teach particular skills that are contained within conversations, raise awareness of that skill, give them some time to practice, to appropriate that skill, and then also give them some time at the end of a lesson. I usually designate the last 5 or 10 minutes as chat time. Just with your partner or in a group, with a partner this time next week in a group, just have a chat about our class or about anything you want. Conversation ultimately is not controlled. We develop it as we go along. That is a problem when it comes to assessment, because if I tell you I want you to talk about this topic, that takes away some of the authenticity of a conversation. That's one of the necessary evils when you're assessing, basically. But to me, I want to teach conversation skills explicitly and try to use authentic or near-authentic texts. The touchstone texts are not authentic, but they're as close as any course book I've seen. There could be another course book that is better, I don't know, but at the moment that's the one that is better for me. And we should look at corpora and think about the frequency of use. If Korean speakers use a phrase that native speakers don't use, and uses it all the time, they're not going to sound natural, because natural means we sound like a native speaker generally. If they do use phrases that native speakers use frequently, and they use them as frequently, then they're going to sound more like a native speaker and sound more natural. So corpora can inform us about what native speakers actually say. This leads us, for 5 minutes, very quick, to assessing conversation. How do we assess conversation? Is it easy?
It's impossible.
Yes, it can be impossible to do reliably. Practicality is a problem. Authenticity is always a problem because it's never authentic, it's always contrived. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. What you can do is try, and I've tried. Actually, I might just skip that, sorry. I'll go to there because we're running out of time. We can look at a conversation and we can try to assess it holistically. To add a little bit more objectivity or reliability, we can break down the elements of a conversation into an analytic rating scale. The more criteria you have, the less practical it's going to be, the harder it's going to be to do it in a specific space of time, but the more objective perhaps and more reliable your test could be. So we need to find a happy medium between them. To me, we can think about fluency, accuracy. We could break grammar and vocabulary into separate categories if we wanted, or we can put them together. Pronunciation, listening, active listening, responding to your partner, and conversation skills. We could also break conversation skills down into different areas and say, did they show interest? Did they manage turn taking? Did they change topics? But the more you have, the longer it's going to take, the harder it's going to be, basically. I would usually go with 4 or 5, possibly 6 if I can. And then the fun part comes to define what constitutes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. For many rubrics I've seen in course books, they just have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you circle a score. 5 is excellent, 4 is very good, 3 is not bad. But what is very good? What is excellent? What is not bad? Nobody knows. So you're just inferring. We can create a rubric that has some specific criteria related to that. You could say they use a wide range of conversation skills naturally. They don't use any conversation skills. They use some but have trouble maintaining these kinds of things. So this is an example of how we could break it down. We could do the same thing with grammar and vocabulary, of course, as well. One thing I'll say quickly before you ask a question. We need to be careful when we assess conversation for our class. We're not assessing their conversation skill as proficiency. We're assessing it as achievement, as to whether they have they achieved the content, the goals and objectives and the content of the course. So when we assess conversation skills, we can't assess all conversation skills, the ones we taught in the class. For grammar, we can't say that student's grammar is really good and they're not so good. We have to focus on the grammar that was taught in the class and the vocabulary that was taught in the class. Everything has to reflect the content. As soon as we step outside of that, we've got huge validity problems because we're assessing something that we didn't actually teach. So this conversation test should be an achievement test, not a proficiency test.
That's why my test floats all over the paper when I start doing, when I start testing. I have like a long checklist that eventually begins to float because I need to teach them that stuff.
Yeah. Some students, you have students who go to America and their conversation is better than the students that haven't been to America for a year to study. But if the student that hasn't been to America uses the grammar and vocabulary you taught accurately, uses the conversation skills that you taught accurately, and the student that's been to America, they didn't study because I can speak English really well, and they don't attend to the requirements of your assessment, then they can get a lower score, even though their English conversation proficiency is high, because you're assessing your class, not their general English proficiency.
I'm lucky enough to have higher level students this year, so I agree with you completely, but haven't done that this semester. So I'm going with more of an objective, sort of general view. In your view, like on this grade here, depends on your university, obviously, but what would say a B grade B, B plus, no B minus? On this, if you had everyone score a 3, say, I'm just asking you, what would you grade that? C plus maybe, or?
Well, this is just for one category, conversation
No, I know, but
skills. So,
suppose they got just a 3.
so if you had grammar and all that, if you had 5 different
And
categories,
they got 3s and all.
and then they got 3 across for 5 categories, then they would get 15 out of 25, for example.
But you can't do that on a straight.
It depends if it's the way you assess is norm referenced or criterion referenced.
Yeah.
Some schools have a bell curve that you need to fit into. So you could be ranking them against each other, or you could be ranking them against, assessing them against the criteria, which is what we should be doing, I think, but not necessarily.
Well, they told me average performance for your ability is B. But at my school, in the States, it was a C.
That depends on cultural issues and institutional issues. Different institutions have different ideas of what is an A or a B. An A in Seoul University or an A in this university is going to be the same. The institutional factor there. I'll just quickly, I was going to skip through some stuff. I've got my email address on here, so I can send you this if I want, if you want to. If I want, not if I want. If you want, you can get my email address and I can send you this file and some other stuff. I'll just take 2 minutes to say you must record your speaking or conversation test. If you don't, and the student comes to you and says, why did I get such and such a grade? You say, because of this, this, this. And they say, well, prove it. You can't.
Is that really happening?
Yes, that's happened to me. You always get some really annoying student that comes in with questions. I've always recorded conversation tests and speaking
Even
tests.
the regular university students, or are you talking about the teachers you're teaching?
Regular university students.
Really?
It might not happen, but and if you don't record, you can get away with it. No one comes up and queries you. But in theory, a speaking test should be recorded because there's no evidence otherwise. Spoken language disappears. You say it and it's gone. After this talk, if you say to me, oh, you said blah, 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 I'll deny everything. But that video recorder right there will be able to prove who's correct or not. Yeah.
If you record, you can get colleagues, other teachers to help you assess it, and you get a lot better at it.
Exactly. That will increase the inter-rater reliability.
Defense team. A defense team.
Yeah. Well, the longer you spend on assessment, the larger the sample is, the more people who assess it, the more detailed your rubric is, the more reliable it's going to be, the more objective, the more accurate it's going to be. If you just solely rely on the end of semester final exam, that's conversation, that's not going to be so reliable. If you triangulate with midterms, with homework assignments, with a written test, then you're going to have a much better picture, much more accurate picture of their ability. One quick thing, I did use messenger service as a form of assessment for my students in the past. I gave them 5 to 10 minutes during my office hours. They could log in and chat to me. To me, that's better than writing some text or writing a dialogue. They can chat. It's very similar to conversation, except it's just written mode and not in spoken form. So I did that as a form of homework. The more time you spend assessing, the more effective it's going to be. So practicality is always an issue.
Do you use video or audio
Good
to
question.
record?
In the teacher training program, a long time ago, we used a video recorder for the oral exam, the speaking exam, and they all freaked out because there's a video camera recording their face. And some of the girls didn't put on makeup, they were mortified. So I recommended that we get voice recorders to take away that inhibition. However, if we're talking about conversation, there are elements of conversation as far as eye contact and those sorts of things. We can't see that from the voice recorder. We can only focus on the actual language that's produced. So there could be justification for using a video recorder, but I think students tend to freak out when they see that. So, any other questions?
I mean, I wanted to say, somebody said that it was kind of impossible to really assess whether or not a conversation is a success or not. But it's like any
You're
other,
right.
it's really like any, like you were talking about an achievement. It's really any, it's like a test, if you look at it, it's a test of endurance rather than the students that I've taught some adults in business English as well. And they go out there and as soon as they gain the mastery of simple conversation, they go out and do other things besides speak English that makes them feel it's an added plus to their lives to have mastered another language.
Right.
It's just if you look at it in those terms, then it's not impossible to assess. It's impossible to follow them around and see what they do.
Yeah, it's hard to do it objectively and practically, basically. Yeah.
I was just going to suggest Audacity for recording. It's it's a program online.
Right.
You can download it for free. Audacity.
So you can use that.
If you have your laptop, you could bring that
Yeah.
and
So-
just turn it away from them maybe. And
Right.
they could even listen
A
to it
webcam.
after.
Oh, you could get one of those pinhole cameras, and then they
They don't even know.
don't even know. There are problems with that, ethical problems. Whenever you record your students, you need to tell them that they're being recorded.
Yeah.
There are ethical issues involved in that. I'll just mention quickly some books. Barbara mentioned before, Conversation Strategies, which is here. Oxford's book, Conversation. This is a really good book. This is basically the Bible these days if you want to teach conversation. Conversation from description to pedagogy. It doesn't have a lot on assessment. If you look up conversation assessment, there's nothing, basically. So this book here, a couple other things. Course books, English Upgrade has some elements of conversation. Icon and Touchstone. These are three. I prefer Touchstone. Handshake is a business English book that has a lot of elements of conversation strategies in, if you teach business English. We don't have time, so I'll just go through a couple of things, and I'll put my email address so I can send you this and these references. There are books on assessing speaking, which you can check out, of course. I'm Australian, and luckily a lot of research into conversation and casual conversation is done in Australia. The National Centre for English Language Teaching and Research has done a lot of analysis of conversation and how to teach it. These are all free booklets and articles. You can get them on the internet. About half of them are written by Michael McCarthy, and there's a few other ones. We've got course book, 10 criteria for spoken grammar. There are a lot of books using corpus and spoken fluency. This article is in English Profile Journal, which is a free journal online. Type in English Profile Journal, and you can get some articles. This is absolutely recommend this article by Michael McCarthy. If you went to Cambridge Day, that's the competition. Cambridge Day this year? I think this year, last year? I don't know. Last year. Michael McCarthy's talk was very, very illuminating for me. He talked about response tokens. and how it affects fluency, so that's very, very interesting. And just my references and my email address. So I covered everything in 45 minutes regarding conversation. That's got to be a record. And if you have any questions, I'll be out there or in here for a while, and I can send you this PPT via email.